So let's take a look at manipulating formulas, and let's start with something that you're probably not going to use in this class here, but let's start with the formula that everybody knows, that nobody understands. E equals mc squared. I won't say nobody understands. There are people who understand it, but this is a very famous equation that Einstein came up with that equates energy and matter. Essentially, he said that they're the same thing. Save that for another course. But let's play around with manipulating this. The thing that you have to remember is that right now, this equation is valid. These two sides are equivalent, and you can do whatever you want to this equation as long as you do the same thing to both sides. So if we want to multiply both sides by, I don't know, pi, we can do that. These two sides, this equation is still equivalent. Both sides are still equal to the same thing. Let's undo that. If we want to divide both sides by, by something, say, I don't know, a potato. I'll draw a potato here. There's our potato. It doesn't matter. These two things are still equivalent. Now I'm kind of talking nonsense here, but you get the point. Whatever I do to one side of the equation, I have to do to the other side for these two sides to be equal. As soon as you start doing something like, say, dividing one side by potato and the other side by carrot, unless a potato equals a carrot, these two things, this equation breaks down. It no longer works for us. That's the big thing that we have to remember. It does not matter what we do to the equation as long as we are doing the same thing to both sides. So here's another example. If we want to take the square root of one side, if we take the square root of the other side, still works. The square root of E equals the square root of mc squared. Now we can play around with that further. We can multiply it by, I don't know, let's go pi again. Let's divide it by 7. Let's take the, I don't know, let's make that both of those sides to the power of 3. It doesn't matter what you do as long as you're doing the same thing to both sides of that equation. Now, this is kind of a superpower. If we take this and take that idea and we use it to our advantage, it means that we can actually rearrange and manipulate this formula in all kinds of really fantastic ways. And so, let's take E equals mc squared, and let's say that we know what E equals. We know that E is equivalent or equal to mc squared, which is mass times the speed of light squared. But what if we wanted to solve for m? Let's say we knew the other variables, and we want to get m on its own. So knowing what we know, that we can do whatever we want to this equation, provided that we do the same thing to both sides, we can use that superpower to isolate m. I guess there's one other superpower that we could acknowledge here, and that is that anything divided by itself is just 1. So E divided by E is 1, M divided by M is 1, C squared divided by C squared is 1, and when it's equivalent to 1, that can really simplify things. So let's take that kind of separate superpower along with our first one, and let's manipulate this formula to find m, or to isolate m. And so let's start by saying, okay, well, m, what is it beside here? M, we've got an mc squared, so it'd be really great if that c squared disappeared. So we can't just remove it, but what we can do is we can make it 1. So we could have m times 1, and m times 1 is just m. So if we can turn c squared into 1, then we've effectively we've removed it from that side, and we have m times 1, or m. And so the way to do that, so we just saw, if we take c squared and we were to divide it by c squared, then that c squared divided by c squared is going to be 1. But before we do that, we need to remember our first superpower here, that we need, whatever we do to one side, we have to do to another. So let's divide the e by c squared. And now let's take a look at this here. C squared divided by c squared, these two things here, c squared divided by c squared is equal to 1. So we could rewrite this entire formula here as e divided by c squared equals m times 1. And well, what's m times 1? Anything times 1 is itself. And so that is the same as m. So e divided by c squared is equal to m. It's as though these two c squares just annihilated each other. It's as though they just kind of canceled out. What we know is that they turn to 1, and 1 times m is just m, but they've effectively canceled each other out. And so this here is our nice little formula for finding mass. And so if we know the energy, if we know the speed of light, we can plug those numbers in there and we can find the mass. And so we've manipulated this formula. Let's go down a little bit, and why don't we start with our initial formula? E is equal to mc squared. And let's say that we want to get the c on its own. We want to isolate that. So same thing, we have, this would be pretty simple, or rather we'd be moving in the right direction if that m wasn't there. So we want to get rid of that m. Well, we just saw that if you divide a number by itself, by itself, it equals 1, but we have to do that to both sides. So m divided by m is 1. It's effectively canceled itself out. So now you have 1 times c squared. So let's rewrite that. We have e divided by m equals 1 times c squared. Well, 1 times c squared is just c squared. So forget about the 1. It's there. It's just, we don't need to write it. It is not doing anything for us. And now we have that c squared. So we're pretty close. The question is how do we get rid of that square? And if we take the square root of a number that is squared, we've effectively canceled that out. So let's take the square root of that side there, and we have to do the same thing to the other side. And what we end up with is the square root of e divided by m is equal to c, and so we've isolated that there. And so we have, really with these two superpowers, right? Superpower number 1, you can do whatever you want to a formula. Does not matter as long as you are doing the same thing to both sides. That is superpower number 1. Superpower number 2, you can essentially eliminate variables by dividing by themselves. So m divided by m is 1. C squared divided by c squared is 1. E divided by e is 1. And in that way, you're essentially, we taking those two superpowers together, we can take almost any formula and rearrange it to isolate the variable that we're looking for. Let's take another example here that we might find, or that you will find in this course. So let's take one here. So let's go, energy is equal to mv squared divided by 2. Now this is kinetic energy formula, so it's the energy of motion. And let's say that we want to solve this for m. So we want to get this m on its own. So what can we do here? Well, let's start by getting rid of that 2 at the bottom. And so just as in the past, we've seen that taking a number, dividing it by itself is going to give us 1. So that suggests here that if we multiply both sides of this equation by 2, essentially what we have here, let me rewrite this. I'll go 2ek is equal to mv squared let's go 2mv squared divided by 2. So we've got a 2 on the top, we've got a 2 on the bottom. 2 divided by 2 is 1. So now we have 2ek is equal to 1mv squared. 1mv squared is the same as mv squared. So let's rewrite this again. 2ek is equal to mv squared. Remember, we're trying to isolate for m. So let's get rid of this v squared here. How are we going to do that? What could we divide v squared by in order to get 1, right? That's our second superpower here. So v squared divided by v squared. On that side, of course, whatever we do on one side, we have to do to another. That's our first superpower. And so we have v squared divided by v squared, which is 1. So we have 1 times m. 1 times m is just m. So let's rewrite this now. We have 2 times the kinetic energy divided by the square of the velocity is equal to m. We have just isolated for m. And so really just using those two superpowers, which once again is that you can do whatever you want to a formula provided that you do the same thing to both sides. And superpower number 2, you can essentially remove any variable or turn any variable into 1 by dividing it by itself. So v squared divided by v squared is going to be fun, which is essentially equivalent to removing it from that side of the equation. So hopefully that helps.